friends, welcome to the Avocado Toast Budget. If you're new here, my name is Lexa, and today we're going to talk about some of my top favorite budgeting tips for beginners. We've got a lot to cover in this video, so let's go ahead and get into it. Tip number one is don't try to slash your spending overnight. What commonly happens, especially when we first start budgeting, is that we go through, we review our spending, and we realize just how much money we're spending in categories like groceries, fun money, eating out, hobbies. And a lot of us, especially at the beginning, don't have a lot of wiggle room between our income and all of our expenses. So it's really tempting to look at those bigger spending categories and feel like you just want to completely slash your spending in that category and cut out as much as possible. When I first started budgeting, I realized that the month before that, I had spent $900 on DoorDash. I didn't have $900 to be spending on DoorDash. And my gut reaction was to be like, no more DoorDash. Obviously, this is an issue. Gotta cut it off. But when I actually took a step back and asked myself, why was I spending that money on DoorDash? I realized that DoorDash was providing for me a really key thing that I needed in my life. I was a really busy grad student who was working like basically the equivalent of 2 full-time jobs, but one of them wasn't paid because they were my supervision hours. I was exhausted, really struggling with my mental health, and DoorDash was providing me a way to eat, honestly, because I wasn't gonna cook. Because cooking all of the time just felt so overwhelming to me, and in my mind, I very much felt like it was like one or the other. Like, if I started cutting back DoorDash at all, I needed to just cut it out completely. And to be honest with you, the idea of cooking all of the time overwhelmed the shit out of me, and it wouldn't have been sustainable. So instead, I resolved to switching out DoorDash one time a week. Just one time, starting off, seeing if there was one meal that I could make, one easy thing I could come up with, even if it meant buying like the $8 pre-packaged, pre-made like little meals that they had, like not the frozen food ones, but like the fancy ones that they had in the refrigerated section at like the entrance of the store, that I always was like, oh, that's so expensive. I'm not gonna pay $8 to $10 for food that's at the grocery store. But like $8 to $10 is a lot better than like $30 that I was spending on a meal to get it delivered on DoorDash. And slowly but surely, I was able to find ways to cut my spending from $900 a month on DoorDash to now I spend like $150. Plus, what happens whenever we try to slash our spending is that often it just doesn't work because we're creating a budget that is meant for an ideal version of our life rather than a budget that is actually for our real life and our real circumstances right now. And then when it fails, you feel like you failed rather than recognizing that the budget just wasn't set up for you. That can be really disheartening, and then oftentimes we just quit and we think that we suck at managing our money, so what's the point? So if you would like to reduce your spending in categories like groceries or fun money, try to find ways to cut it by just like $10, $20, $30 chunks at a time, and challenge yourself to meet those little stair-step goals along the way until you have reached your final end goal. Or you might realize along the way that your final end goal wasn't realistic at all, and that's totally okay too. It's a lot better to figure out ways how to cut your grocery budget from $1,000 to $500 over the course of a year in a way that is actually sustainable for you, rather than cutting it by $500 one month and then never returning to your budget again. Tip number 2 is to avoid making life-changing or monumental financial decisions at the beginning. Now, I don't say this to scare you because a lot of financial decisions are reversible / manageable even if you feel like you've made a mistake on them. There are ways to kind of counteract that mistake, but there are certain things that I see people deciding on at the beginning or making big decisions on that when you're first starting out, you don't really have all of the information that you need in order to decide if that is a decision that is right for you. 2 things come to mind that are the most common ones that I see. First is refinancing student loans if your student loans are federal student loans. This was a mistake that I actually almost made, and I'm so glad that I didn't. I actually went through the whole approval process to get my student loans refinanced the month before COVID hit, and student loans were put on pause. The tricky part with that is that yes, I would have gotten, it was such a low APR. It was like 1.8 or 2%, something like that. But once you refinance from a federal student loan to a private student loan, you give up a lot of the benefits of federal student loans, such as forgiveness, forbearance, income-based repayment plans. The nice thing about private student loans is that, especially if you have a good credit score and you're refinancing at the right time and you're shopping around, you could end up saving a lot of money over the long term by having a lower interest rate. But you're giving up a lot of those benefits. So if I had refinanced to private student loans, I wouldn't be eligible for any forgiveness, which right now I'm eligible for $20,000 if that ends up going through. And I would have had been making payments on those loans while they were accruing interest these last 2 years. 3 years? Oh my God, it's almost 3 years of COVID. No. I know that 2023 minus 2020 is 3 years, but my brain can't compute that it's actually been 3 years of this. Hey, you poked a hole in the water bottle? Can you not? The point is, I almost made this financial decision because I thought being debt-free was the #1 goal that I should have, and that I should be doing whatever possible to get toward debt freedom as quickly as possible. But now I've realized that that's not really my biggest goal. I don't care about being debt-free for the sake of being debt-free. And instead of putting that $500 a month toward my student loan payment, I've been putting $500 a month in an investment account. The second big decision that I see people making a lot at the beginning that they regret is canceling all of their credit cards. Now, this is especially common because most likely if you've been introduced to any personal finance advice, it was through Dave Ramsey, and he is all about credit scores are an I love debt score, doesn't matter, cancel all of your credit scores, you're never gonna need it again. Listen, I have a lot to say about that. We know, if you don't already know my feelings about it, I got a whole playlist on it, okay? Do whatever works for you ultimately, but the tricky part with making that decision at the beginning, before you really know what works for you and you really understand what your financial goals are, is that that is a very permanent decision that can affect your credit score for a really long time. Because there is a section of your credit score that is made up by how long you have had a credit history, and by canceling your oldest credit card or all of your credit cards, it can really negatively impact that portion of your credit score, which then if you realize that you want to buy a home or you need to take out a car loan or any sort of thing that involves needing a good credit score, it can take a really long time to build back up that credit history. Like decades of time. So whenever possible, try to avoid making some of those more permanent or larger or irreversible financial decisions at the beginning until you really have locked down what your financial goals truly are and how managing your money works best for you. Tip number 3 is to set up autopay for all of your bills whenever possible. Late payments can not only really negatively impact your credit score, but they can also cost you a lot of money over the long term. And they can really set you back on reaching your financial goals, especially when you're first getting started and you're a lot more aware of your spending and where your money is going. Now, this could be really straightforward because a lot of like subscriptions and bills are automatically set to autopay, but it can be really tricky when you have those handful of ones that aren't. And it's really hard, especially when, you know, life happens, to remember all of those dates and make sure that you have paid those bills on time. So if the business or the person that you are paying doesn't allow on their end for autopay, you can actually set up autopay through your bank a lot of times. You can call up your bank. If you know like that their information, especially their banking information, you can have your bank automatically like make those payments and those withdrawals for you on a month-to-month basis. You just have to call and set that up. If your bank doesn't allow for that, there are actually like online resources that will write money orders and like send them to the person, or write checks for you and send them to them. Sometimes there's like a little fee, but a lot of times if you just hook up your bank directly, they waive that fee for you. And honestly, a $1 fee is so much better than piling on a bunch of late fees. So if you're someone who suffers from a lot of late fees because you forget to pay those things that you can't like set to autopay in the normal fashion, it might be definitely worth checking one of those two options out. I personally had to do this for my trash service. If you've watched any of my videos recently, you know when I moved into this new house, the trash service I set up, it's on every 3 months, and they wouldn't let me just like pay for the year. But I actually figured out, they didn't tell me this, I asked if there was a way for me to autopay, and they said no, that they would just ship me a thing. But then I was talking to one of my friends who has the same service, and they were like, no, I definitely autopay online. I do not call them ever. So I actually looked online, and they were set up through one of those payment services that I just had to fill out my information, fill out theirs, and they, every month, I have it scheduled that they will take money out of my account and then write them the check. It's verified, not a sketchy service. Make sure you're not using a sketchy service. I don't remember what it's called, but I'll figure it out and I'll either put it up here or down in the description box down below. But that was a game changer for me because the first time I almost missed my payment because I forgot. Because who remembers to pay a bill every 3 months? Not I. Number 4 is to focus on the big 3. The big 3 are the 3 categories where we often spend the most money. These are housing, transportation, and food. For most people, that eats up the majority of your budget, and therefore it's the most efficient to look at ways that you can cut back your spending. And therefore, it's the most efficient to look at ways that you can cut back your spending in one of those 3 or all 3 categories, rather than trying to cut out like little expenses here and there. Which, don't get me wrong, little expenses matter and they add up over time. But if you've got some big financial goals, or you have been really spiraling into debt very quickly because of your spending, starting with those 3 categories, looking at where your money is going, and seeing if there's any ways that you can cut back in those categories is going to be very helpful. I talked about this more in my video on lifestyle inflation. I give a ton of tips on creative ways that you can start saving money in those categories, and how to figure out which one of those categories is the one that is like taking up the most room in your budget and how to go about navigating that. If I had to just pick one of those 3 categories, start with food first, because that's usually where most of us are overspending and we have the most wiggle room. But this really ties into tip number 1, where you want to cut back incrementally rather than slashing overnight. You can cut your spending over time on categories like transportation and housing, but for a lot of us, those are bigger life decisions on moving, downsizing your house. They're important decisions to make if you need to make them, but they're not something that like you can start implementing today. The point is, it's probably not just like a $6 iced coffee that is causing you to feel out of control with money. It's probably better to look at those 3 categories as a whole and see what's going on there. Tip number 5 is to try out different budgeting methods. Chances are the first type of budget that you try is not going to be the budget that works for you. I tried so many different things when I was first starting. I tried cash envelope spending. Come to find out, I literally do 0% of my spending in cash. And I hate doing things like going inside to pay for gas or even going to the grocery store. I get my groceries delivered. So cash envelopes were not for me. I tried handwriting out all of my budget, keeping like a notebook. Absolutely not. It wasn't until like the 4th or 5th different method that I finally found YNAB, which is the budgeting system that like hands down has worked for me consistently throughout these last few years. But had I given up at the cash envelope system because that one didn't work for me, I wouldn't be here today. I would still be struggling with credit card debt, probably even deeper into credit card debt. So give yourself the space and time to try out different things and figure out what works for you and what doesn't. And it's very okay if a popular budgeting method doesn't work for you for one reason or another. If you want to know about what kinds of different budgeting methods are out there so that you can start dabbling in a few, figure out which one does work for you, I have a video on my top 5 favorite, and I will link that up here in the cards and down in the description box down below. For me personally, the zero-based budgeting method was the one that clicked for me. Technically, both the cash envelope system and YNAB operate off of that same budgeting method. It's just that they go about it in 2 very different ways. But the principle behind it is that you just give every single dollar a job, and rather than trying to create a budget that is based off of like future numbers, what you think that you're going to be making like next month, like traditional budgeting is, where at the start of the month you create a budget for that month and then you assume you're going to get paid a certain amount, you assume you're going to be spending a certain amount. Zero-based budgeting, you adjust as you go along. You do make some sort of a plan, but only with the money that you have on hand right now. And with that money, you make sure that every single penny that you have has a purpose, whether that is toward paying a bill, reaching a savings goal, paying off debt, spending money, it's going somewhere. Tip number 6 is to include non-monthly expenses. This one was such a game changer for me. I don't know why, until someone like laid it out for me, I didn't think to do this. It's such an easy concept once you know about it, but it's something that, because budgeting feels like a more of a monthly thing, we don't think about some of those bigger, less frequent expenses that often in the personal finance world, these are referred to as sinking funds. I've talked a ton about sinking funds here on my channel. I will link some resources if you want to learn more. But these are often the expenses that catch us off guard. They're usually a lot more expensive than some of our monthly expenses. And whenever they come around, it can really trip us up financially. It can put us deeper into debt. It's often, I know for me, the reason that I would end up spiraling into credit card debt was because I would feel like I was finally making progress, and then bam, one of these expenses would come around and I wouldn't be prepared for it. I talk about tons of examples of non-monthly expenses in my expenses you're forgetting to budget for video. We are just listing out tons of resources. This is like the resource hub video for if you want to learn more about any of these concepts I'm talking about. But some of my favorite examples to use are things like vacations, which yes is an expense, less frequent expense, that you want to be able to save up for so that you can take a vacation without worrying about the financial impact it might have. Other things like car repairs or home maintenance or any big home renovations. These are expenses that we might not know exactly how much we're going to need to spend or when we're going to need to spend it, but we do know that they're going to come up eventually. So setting money aside for those and planning ahead is going to be huge in making your budget actually last for you and not being thrown off by some of these bigger, less frequent expenses. Another big one is holidays. This used to always trip me up at the end of the year. I would try to like do all of my Christmas shopping on one paycheck, but that paycheck also needed to pay for all of my bills and food and stuff. And then I would end up inevitably putting gifts on a credit card that I couldn't afford to pay off. Whereas if I saved up throughout the year, little bits at a time for that bigger expense, I knew it was coming. I knew I was gonna need that money eventually. I would have been much more prepared for it and not had to use a huge chunk of a paycheck that was already doing the most. It was doing a lot of work. Number 7 is to focus on function over aesthetics. I would be lying if I said the main reason that I wanted to try out the cash envelope system wasn't because of all of the videos that I saw on it with like the cute, very aesthetic envelopes and the cash envelope wallet. Yes, I bought one of those. It is a nice big wallet, but I don't have any cash in it. And just how like pretty and organized and put together it made people seem like they were. And I wanted that. I wanted to inhabit that, but it wasn't functional. So it didn't matter how aesthetic or pretty it didn't work for me. The same thing applied to Excel spreadsheets. I would go on Excel and shop for those like beautiful, like pre-planned Excel budgets that were gorgeous and had amazing graphs and made me feel good about like my financial goals and where I was going, but I didn't keep up with it. So therefore it didn't work because I had to go in and actually like input all of that, and that wasn't happening. I find ways to make my YNAB budget more aesthetic and fun for me, like putting emojis in front of all of the different categories. But the reality of it is that like the graphs and the setup of YNAB is not my vibe, but it does work for me. And that's all that really matters at the end of the day. The emojis are fun. They keep me a little bit interested. It is important to find ways to gamify and be interested in your budget, but not at the fault of not using it, because it's not the system that works for you. So try to not get too caught up in like those videos and Excel spreadsheets that you see. If they're not working for you, don't force it. Now you might find that it does. You might find that one of those systems that is pretty and aesthetic also is very functional, and that's awesome. But don't sacrifice what is actually going to fit for your lifestyle and how managing your money works best for you just to look like you have your life together. We're leaving that behind. That is 2022 bullshit. 2023, even if it looks messy, even if it doesn't look aesthetic, but it works for you, that is the energy we are channeling. Number 8 is to reframe your definition of budgeting. Oftentimes when I say the word budget, people cringe a little bit, and I get it, okay? It's a hard sell, especially because we've been sold a very black and white picture of what budgeting looks like and what budgeting effectively means and looks like. And I really encourage people to try to let go of some of that and really just think about budgeting as making your money work for you and your life in whatever way that looks like. It might look like having a very detailed, structured budget that you feel confident in sticking to and that you tweak when necessary to work for you in your life, but that you are very on top of and spend a lot of time on. If you are someone who needs that structure and thrives on that, that's awesome. But also, it could just look like something like the 3-account budgeting system that I've talked about here on the channel before, where all of your money goes into one checking account, and then you have a checking account for bills, a checking account for spending, and a savings account for your savings goals. That way you only ever have to really reference like those 3 different accounts to see what's going on with your money. And once your bills and your savings/debt payoff goals are taken care of, you know that the money inside of your spending checking account is what you have to spend until you get paid again. And that is good and what works for you. Budgeting doesn't have to be this very strict monthly on top of tracking all of your spending kind of thing. Zero-based budgeting, the method that I use, does involve like tracking your spending, but that's just because that's what personally works for me and makes me feel the most in control of my money without making me feel overwhelmed. But what works for me might not necessarily work for you, and vice versa. So I think sometimes, especially when we're starting off, we get really tripped up on what this process is supposed to look like and what being good at managing your money is supposed to look like. And trust me, that is just gonna lead you down a road that is so frustrating and that ultimately is gonna burn you out. And that's not what we want. We want to set you up for success over the long term, knowing that it's okay if your definition of budgeting changes over that time. So that is it for today's video. I hope you all really enjoyed. If you learned something cool, consider hitting that subscribe button down below, pushing that thumbs up button. Really helps out the YouTube algorithm, helps other people to find this content. I'm always tempted to say that if you've made it to the end of the video to leave like one of the money emojis, but I feel like then we just are always using a money emoji. That's the go-to one, right? But like I want to switch it up. Oh my gosh, my cats were being such a menace during this entire video, so put a cat emoji. Whichever version of the cat emoji speaks the most to your soul. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Fuck, I can't believe I made it through that. Since we're keeping it real here and trying to break down the like financial barriers of shame, this video was supposed to originally have 10 tips, but then I had a panic attack halfway through filming and I couldn't make it all the way through all 10. Couldn't do it. So we made it to 8, but I picked the 8 that were the strongest ones. So I really feel like it all worked out for the best.